Great, we're just waiting for Tarek to join the call. I'm aware it has hit 11 o'clock, so we are just running about a minute late. So thank you very much to everyone who's just in the waiting room for being there patiently. Oh, here we are. So we have Tarek on the call.
Morning.
Great, you have my name, Tarek, but other than that, I think we're there. So brilliant. If I could get the panelists just to put your cameras back on, but keep yourselves on mute for now, that would be brilliant. So thanks very much to everyone who's joining us today. This is the 5th in the series of our What Works seminars as part of our Hopeful Towns project. This is a seminar series looking at what works to build resilience for communities at the local level. So today we're going to be talking about tackling fake news, rumours and misinformation at the local level. What can we do to challenge misinformation in order to build more resilient communities? So my name is Rosie Carter. Which will circulate as a learning note to all attendees and everyone who's signed up. If you haven't already, you can sign up to our Town's Leadership Network. So Chris will be sharing a link about that. He's currently hidden as Hope Not Hate, but he's on the call. So without further ado, I think that's all I need to go through for now. We'll make a start. So misinformation, rumours, fake news, all of these things are quite high profile issues in the age of social media, in a context of declining public trust, a rocky kind of political setting, technological advances. In some ways we have too much information and it's quite hard to know what is true and what isn't. So we've seen these kind of global conspiracies of QAnon, particularly kind of in the context of coronavirus. We've also seen conspiracies about kind of no-go zones. These sorts of things take off all over the world. But today we want to talk a little bit more about what happens at the local level. And this is something that we at Hope Not Hate have seen in our research across the UK, in communities from big towns to smaller cities to little villages. Particularly kind of in the local, in the National Conversation on Immigration, which was a research project we did where we hosted conversations about immigration in towns and cities across the UK. And what we found was quite often that these kind of local rumours had taken seed in places. People would often talk about no-go zones as areas of 2 or 3 streets within their town where they felt quite uncomfortable with the pace of change, but they'd also seen things online, perhaps through local Facebook groups where people had been posting videos, be they kind of people from the local community outside or bots. These information were getting through. We've also seen local rumours spread through trusted figures, people who have a lot of trust within the community. And when these things are spoken about in the local context, they can take like wildfire. We've also seen other things like small points of tension, which might not have been handled too well, maybe by the council, which might lead to local rumours about some people going to the front of the queue and these sorts of things. So what can be done? What can be done at the local level for local authority, for community groups, and all of those who have a vested interest in making our towns more resilient. So we are joined today by a really great panel. So we're going to start with Dr. Joe Mulhall, who is a Senior Research Officer at Hope Not Hate. And he's going to give us a bit of a context of what is the state of misinformation, how does it interact with the far right, and what does that look like locally. So we're then going to go to David Burton Sampson, who's the ex-mayor of Basildon, who's going to give us a real kind of rooting in the local context of what it was like dealing with these issues in Basildon and what can be done. So then we're going to go to Tarek Bashir from the Who Is Your Neighbour project, who's going to talk about his work with that project, building trust to change the conversation at the local level. And then we're going to go to Niall Mann, who's the Regional Communications Manager from IMEX, who's going to talk a bit about local press as a challenge to misinformation. So I'm going to give you all about 10 minutes each. I am going to be keeping an eye on the clock, so watch your messages. There is a Q&A function, and there's also a chat box. So for anyone who has any questions, please drop them in the Q&A and we will get to them at the end. You can say if you want to direct them to a particular speaker or not. You can also use the chat for any comments, any thoughts you might have, or anything you might want us to explore through the session. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Joan Walpole.
Hello, yeah, thanks for having me, Rosie. So as Rosie said, I'm going to talk a little bit about, at Hope Not Hate, within the research team, we spend a lot of time looking at misinformation, disinformation, and increasingly over the last, couple of years, looking really closely at conspiracy theory content and the conspiracy theory movement. So I'm going to kind of come at it a little bit and see what we're seeing, and give a few little case studies, and I'm sure that the other panelists will have some really great, much more localized stuff. It won't surprise you to kind of hear that in the last few years, we've seen a real explosion of engagement with conspiracy theory content, misinformation and disinformation online. Some of it, or much of it, has been at a national level, but of course a huge amount of it plays out at a very local level, in our towns, in our communities, and even in some cases right down to kind of street level, as Rosie mentioned. So I'm going to talk very briefly about this kind of phenomenon during the pandemic, and touch on some stuff that happened in the last election as well, which I think is useful to look at. I mean, broadly speaking, just to clarify, when I talk about conspiracy theories, I'm kind of defining them as an explanation of historical, ongoing, or future events that cites as a main causal factor a group of powerful persons or conspirators acting in secret for their own benefit against the common good. With misinformation and disinformation, it's conscious or information that is either consciously or unconsciously untrue and passed around for various causes. Now, the pandemic has caused a huge explosion of people engaging with conspiracy theory content, misinformation and disinformation. Some of it pernicious and some of it not, some of it just mistaken. From the early 2020 onwards, we've seen this kind of explosion of the amount of this content online. And as a result, far more people are engaging with it. Now, I'm sure you've heard of it, but when it comes to some of it, a lot of this is obviously specifically to do with COVID itself. Amongst the common theories we've seen lots of, and I'm sure you've seen the same, is the idea is that this disease was consciously released as a bioweapon, that the whole of the disease is a hoax. Some people throw in 5G radiation from the Wi-Fi as the actual cause of the health crisis. There is no health crisis at all. And when it comes down to the more conscious elements of this, it's done for a whole host of reasons. Some argue that it's done to weaken Western economies, either for the benefit of China or for this great reset they keep talking about of the global economy. Previously, they talked about it being the idea was to subvert the US presidential elections, which it obviously didn't. There is this idea that we are ushering in a totalitarian controls over our populations, that we are microchipping people, that we are radically depopulating the globe, or some combination of all of them. Now, when it comes to conspiracy theory content and fake news and these sorts of things, many of these conspiracy theories predate the COVID period and the pandemic. Things that Wi-Fi is dangerous, all vaccines are dangerous, etc. Many of these things predate COVID. What's really worrying that we've seen in the last year is the development of these into what we call super conspiracies. Super conspiracies essentially are theories that are very adaptable, but they are based on the idea that there is a single conspirator behind them. Lots of people ask, why are conspiracy theories and fake news and misinformation, why is that Hope Not Hate's problem? Well, in one sense, when it's talking about the moon landings or JFK, it's not particularly, but when people start to tie various conspiracy theories together, they need a conspirator. And invariably when there's a conspirator, that's when we start to see prejudice and discrimination come into this, because invariably, or historically, of course, it's often been the Jewish population. But we also see the same when it comes around to kind of attacks against the Muslim community around no-go zones and the like. One of the big things that we've obviously been monitoring is QAnon, this kind of slightly peculiar American theory that started back in 2017. It emerged in these strange corners of the online world. This idea that there is a secret cabal of satanic pedophiles running the world. It sounds ludicrous, of course, but it really kind of spread across the Atlantic last year and grew to really worrying levels in the United Kingdom, and not just here, but also in Germany and across Europe. And while it was a very American phenomenon, for us at a more local level, it took on much more domestic and local issues, right? So one of the things this is, Some of the people were very concerned with Trump and the Republican Party, and it was very American focused. But invariably, as we see misinformation spread and disinformation spread around the globe, it takes on local, really hyper-local characteristics, which is what allows them to embed in our communities. So while there is, the core belief that there is this secret cabal running the world of satanic pedophiles, it took on very local issues like local missing people, local missing children, especially, local scandals around vaccines, etc. So it goes from the global to the national to the local very quickly. And we've seen that in terms of the way that this plays out in terms of organizing online. One of the things that's really worrying is this radicalization pathway. Some of the individuals that we've monitored get involved in really local issues, right? So they get involved in a local anti-lockdown group. And it might be for fine reasons. They might be getting involved in that because they're worried about they're a shop owner and they want their shop to reopen. But there is this kind of more pernicious element where those people are preyed upon and they moved quite quickly down a radicalization pathway towards someone saying, it's not just the fact that this lockdown shouldn't be happening. The lockdown is being used for these various pernicious reasons. And it's not just the lockdown, it's the vaccine, it's 5G. And all of a sudden they start to move into this conspiracy theory space where they start to believe there are secret cabals running the world. And invariably, some of them, unfortunately, move down towards things like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Now, one of the things I think is really useful to look out for is how some things that look local are actually orchestrated and national. And one of the things that we, just a little case study where there was a thing called the Great Reopening, which didn't actually work out, but it was this plan by the conspiracy theory movement based on actually anti-lockdown protests in Italy to try and force a reopening of our shops. And the idea was that people would just reopen at a local level and get on with things. The campaign was organized via dozens of coordinated Telegram channels. And the first way we came across it, I hope not hate, was we started to see dozens of local Telegram channels, like the Great Reopening Bath, the Great Reopening Liverpool, different parts of London. And it looked very organic for a short period until we dug into it and realized that all of those channels had been created at the same time on the same day. And actually there was a national organizer behind it, pushing it and making it look super local and trying to bring in people, understanding, that local people are interested in local issues. So that's something to kind of watch out for. Now, while that didn't work as a tactic, we also saw far-right groups like Patriotic Alternative, a kind of neo-Nazi white supremacist grouping, use those groups to go into them and post local patriotic alternative activism as well. So again, far-right, more organized far-right groupings picking on local online spaces like local Telegram channels and pushing kind of really pernicious and dangerous content. So there's one thing there. We've seen this explosion of conspiracy theory and misinformation around the pandemic. Another one thing to watch out for at a local level is what you might call micro parties and misinformation. So since the collapse of the British National Party, which was kind of the most successful far-right political party in post-war British history, the far-right splintered into dozens and dozens of small far-right groupings. Some obviously went into bigger ones like UKIP, but what we actually saw in recent years is lots and lots of hyper-local political parties campaigning around local issues, many of which don't look particularly far-right, but are actually remnants of things like the British National Party or UKIP. And we've seen them around the country. And while these groups can be quite mixed politically, hyper-local parties often tend to tap into really anti-politics undercurrents that we find in our communities. They're often also very strongly anti-council as well. And sometimes members or supporters of these parties behave aggressively towards local figures, and they use dangerous language around betrayal and this sort of stuff, and they can really poison the debate. I'm sure some of you have come across these local parties. One of the ones at the last election that was a kind of an interesting and worrying case study was back in Oldham. And such groups, they really play into this narrative that overwhelmingly white areas are losing out to non-white areas, tapping into these long-standing historical tensions. And this, of course, can be really dangerous in our communities. In the early 2000s, gains by right-wing independents in some ways actually were the forerunner to the BNP's victories. If you look in Burnley, for example, a group of independents spent years attacking the Labour Council for allegedly favouring the Asian community, kind of spreading misinformation around the Asian community in Burnley. And after stirring up that resentment, when that independent grouping imploded in 2001, the BNP then stepped in and won seats and filled that vacuum. These hyper-local groups and micro-parties, we are seeing them all over the country. And there's not a huge amount of coordination, but they are one to watch. And if you look in the last election, just I'm conscious of time, but In Oldham, in the last elections, there was a group called the Proud of Oldham and Saddlewell Group and the Failsworth Independent Party. They really benefited from a smear campaign, pushing misinformation around local Labour figures, who they accused of corruption and of allowing Asian grooming gangs to operate in the town. And they also alleged that Andy Burnham had blocked police investigations into it and stuff. And while it actually didn't quite get them across the line, it was actually quite close in the end. The guy Fielding was unseated by Failsworth independent candidate Mark Wilson. He lost by less than 200 votes. So these claims spread actually really worryingly in closed communities on Facebook groups, in the case of the Oldham one. And these groups are often founded to discuss local issues. Normal people go into them to discuss local issues, from street lighting to dog dirt on the streets to fencing, you name it, local community issues. And these people have gone into those groups and they've started to move them towards more explicitly political information, and then also to spread misinformation around candidates of various different parties around the country. Again, this is a thing where we've seen hyperlocalism and also unregulated, in the sense that so many of these local groups aren't regulated, or there's just not the capacity to look after them in terms of people like local moderators and stuff. And then finally, the third one I wanted to touch upon as a case study is anti-migrant activism in the last couple of years. The far right have been hugely animated about local issues when it comes to migrant hotels, the hotel accommodation for asylum seekers and migrants. And what we've seen here is far right groupings pushing these narratives in their own channels and then spreading them and trying to cause outrage in more local forums. And one of the real issues here has been a vacuum of information from official channels. So we've seen far right activists turn up at hotels, interview local activists, and then interview just normal local people and saying, did you know this hotel's been taken over? It's a 5-star hotel. It's costing thousands of pounds locally. They're taking your money. There's homeless veterans. We're in the middle of a pandemic. They're giving all the money to the migrants, and whipping up local anger around those hotels, and then attempting to obviously recruit activists and the like and have demonstrations. One of the big issues here has been a lack of local information from the local councils. And this is a big thing when it comes to fighting misinformation at a local level, is filling those information vacuums. One of the big things we find is the far right do best when they are preying on ignorance, when people don't know about what's happening and they turn around and give them an explanation for them, and it might be an incorrect one. So just to finish up then, how do we combat that? Well, of course, one of those things is to make sure at a local level we are providing information, that we are speaking to our local communities, that we are rooted in those local communities, so that when the far right turn up to spread disinformation, people have an alternative truth, or an alternative narrative, that happens to be true, that they can challenge them with. That's a really useful one. Another one, of course, falls onto social media companies. They have to do more to crack down on this stuff. And we can all play a little role in that. I mean, this will require constant vigilance from the platforms, but also ourselves. You know, we need to be in those spaces where the conversations are happening online. We need to be in our local Facebook groups. We need to be on our local Telegram channels. We need to be in our local Twitter lists, etc. And spotting this disinformation and reporting it. Now, the platforms are often terrible at this, but if you're constant and you're regular and you report disinformation where you encounter it, it can draw Facebook's attention to these things, and it can actually affect change. And the other things to do, those in positions of power on this call, whether or not you're council leaders or council workers, formally writing to platforms in advance of things like elections and saying, we're really worried about the misinformation being spread in these groups. We want to make sure there's extra vigilance here, kind of drawing attention to their policy teams around this sort of stuff. All of the big platforms have misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theory, social policy teams that you should try and contact and build relationships with around misinformation. Speak to your political parties. Again, all of the main political parties will have relationships with those platforms as well. And then during electorally, of course, broadly, a lot of the misinformation we see at local levels is based on things like culture war and anti-politics messaging. And they also really play on a sense of local pride, and they play into the emotional ties to our areas. And often we see local councillors, they are seen in these groups as being run from Westminster, as being distant, as not engaging, rather than motivated by local concerns. The best way we're going to fight misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories is to create at a local level trusted partners and trusted messengers that can challenge these narratives from a perspective that they will be believed. Turning up once every 5 years before an election it isn't going to work. We need to root ourselves as campaigners and progressive movements and political parties in our communities, because that is always going to be the best way that we're going to fight these. So yes, we can fight on the tech platforms, and we need to continue to do that. And we need to be more vigilant there. But I think there's longer term strategies about rooting ourselves in communities and creating trusted messengers that can challenge conspiracy theories and misinformation. And I think that's 10 minutes, quite close.
I think you've missed your warning, but that was really brilliant. Thank you so much, Joe. And I think that sets us up really nicely. I mean, it's quite scary hearing some of the scale of these global conspiracies, but I think as well, talking about these kind of local buying and selling Facebook groups that get co-opted by Islamophobic videos or whatever it is, we're coming across these things at the local level. And I think today what we really want to explore is that online and offline element and how they intersect. So I'm going to go next to David Burton-Sampson, who's going to talk a bit about his time as Mayor of Basildon and coming across these things at the local level. So going to root us right down in that context. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Rosie, and thank you to you and Hope Not Hate for all the work you do. You're an absolutely fantastic organisation, and I'm really interested. I've been interested for many years in following the way you challenge, the way you campaign, and the way that you fight to stop hate in our community. So thank you for having me here today. A bit of context to me, as Rosie's pointed out, until about a week and a half ago, I was the Mayor of Basildon, local Labour councillor. I'm also founder of Basildon Pride, and I am currently chair of the CIO that we've set up as part of Basildon Pride. And one of the other roles I carry is I'm chair of what's called the Basildon Independent Advisory Group. We act as a critical friend to the local police force. So real good involvement in lots of local issues that are going on, especially around hate crime, hate speech, and so on and so forth. Carry a number of other roles as well. I like to say I have my fingers in many pies. Bit context to me. I'm a gay man and I am of mixed heritage. If I told you my full heritage, we would be here all day. The only bit of Englishness I thought I had in me was my granddad. And then when he died, I found out that actually his mum was French and his dad was Scottish. So yeah, I am a mixture of all sorts of stuff. I'm originally from Liverpool and I moved to Basildon just over 20 years ago. I was down south for a couple of years before, living in London. Met my other half, who's a born and bred Basildon lad. And then I moved out here when we fell in love. And I've lived here ever since. Bit of context, I'm just going to give you a bit of context to Basildon and then talk about some of the issues that we have experienced over recent years here. Basildon's very much a new town. It was part of Lewis Silkin, the Labour MP's New Town Act in 1946. It was an idea to create these new towns to basically create the overflow from the bombed out areas, specifically around here in London, and to create an aspirational place where people can have a new life. So technically, Basildon's only 72 years old. The interesting thing about Basildon, though, is many areas of the borough are much, much older. In fact, going back hundreds of years with hundreds of years of history. And when the new town was built, there was massive opposition to it from the locals at the time. Basildon as a town was pretty much just built on fields, but the surrounding areas very, very much, there was a lot of opposition from places like Pitsea and Leindon to the redevelopment that was going on. It's, believe it or not, the biggest economy in South Essex. If you stand at Canary Wharf and look down the River Thames, we are the biggest economy past Canary Wharf, with the Ford's plant here and the Leonardo tractor plant and the Leonardo defense plant and so on and so forth. There's a lot of industry here, yet very few people who live in Basildon actually work in Basildon. A lot of people come in to take these jobs from other areas in the surrounding areas of Essex. So we have a skills gap here to allow people to take some of those really better paid roles that are on offer in the borough. There's a massive social and economic divide here. It's a very split borough. We've got some of the most affluent areas in this country in Basildon. If you go to Billericay, home of Gavin and Stacey, you will see one of the most affluent roads. It's in the top 5 most affluent roads in the whole country. Yet if you go to areas like Pitsea and Vange, you will see some of the bottom 10 most deprived areas in our country, all within one borough. Now, there's been a massive change over the years as well in terms of diversity. So, and I'm talking visible ethnic diversity. So when I first moved here, if I was walking along the high street, I would very much be the only person of any colour that you would notice on the high street. And that's before people even open their mouths. Now, it's very different. There's a real cultural mix living in Basildon, many different cultures from all over the world. We're very much seen as the political bellwether for the country. Often what's happening in Basildon will be reflected nationally. And we even saw that with the rise of the BNP and with UKIP. In fact, I remember my very last canvas session I was on in 2015 when I was trying to get elected in Pitsea South East Ward. And it was, UKIP was really, really rife here, spreading a lot of misinformation, a lot of fear, a lot of hatred. And I knocked on this lady's door, and this was I had a lot of "I'm not racist, but" comments on the doorstep. But this particular door that I knocked on, it was my last night canvassing, and she said, "I'm not voting for you, I'm voting for the BNP. I said, "Well, that's going to be a bit difficult because there's no BNP candidate." She said, "Well, I'll vote for that UKIP then." And I went, "Well, why?" And she just looked at me and went, "Because people like you need to go back to where you came from." And I went, "I'm sorry." And she went, "People like you." I said, no, I heard you the first time." I said, "Do you know what? I don't want your vote." And I walked off. But that was when it really started to hit home that this was becoming a significant problem in our borough. There was a worrying far-right undertone, often seen and heard. More so online, but also offline. And it's still very much present today. I mean, for me, social media can be used for so much good and is used for so much good. But all too often we see the keyboard warriors who step out in force, hiding behind their computer screens with a perceived God-given right that they're entitled to spout whatever vitriol they like without any recourse and without any fear of causing any harm or offence or hurt to an individual. Hate speech is often unconscious, but there's also the much more sinister conscious bias. And, you know, is it fear of difference? Is it a lack of understanding, or a historical inherited bias passed down from generation to generation? And Hope Not Hate have really helped us here in Basildon to start to provide some insight into why we may be having some of those issues here. And a lot of those thoughts that they gave us really resonated with us. And it's not just about deprivation. There's a competition for resources here, pressure on services, on housing and on jobs, and that perceived misconception that the council are giving all council houses to immigrants and people from London, which we hear all the time. And you know what people are talking about when they say people from London. They're talking about people who are different from us. People have very quickly forgotten that actually this town is made up of people from London that came here 73 years ago and created this town. So rapid change, a really quick population growth going on, and also few heritage assets. As a new town, obviously we haven't got massively old buildings. We have on the periphery in places like Pitsea and Laindon, but in Basildon town centre, we don't really have any any heritage assets. The way I take on some of these challenges that we've got is I like to turn negatives into positives. And I believe that change can not only come from the the community, but needs to be driven by the leaders in that community as well. I'm going to talk about some of the issues we've experienced, and I'm going to start, I was going to mention some of the LGBT issues, but based on time, I'm just going to start with the Black Lives Matter movement that happened last year. During that period after George Floyd had been murdered, we were thinking as a council, what do we do to start to look at ways to support the BAME community? We didn't just want to light up a load of buildings purple or do stuff like that. We wanted to do something that was going to have a lasting change. And literally a couple of weeks after George was murdered, there was 2 hate crimes in very quick succession against 2 Black NHS workers. NHS workers in the middle of the pandemic came home from their shift early in the morning, both of them after a night shift, to find a paper cutout out of a newspaper, letter through their door, telling them to get away now, otherwise they won't be here for much longer. That was a pure threat against them. And you know, this was starting to really get the community concerned. So we engaged with the BAME community. We got them together on a call. We obviously couldn't get them face to face, so we brought them together on a Zoom call like this, and we just let them talk. We let them talk about what the fears were, what the challenges were, what their issues were, and what they thought we could do about it, and how we could help them as a community start to repair some of these issues that were happening in our society. And on the back of that, we set up what's called Basildon Side by Side. This is a community-led organisation, but very much supported by the council. And they're working on 5 thematic groups. Firstly, around education and economic development. And that's got 2 strands in terms of making sure that young people of colour and ethnic origin have the same opportunity as the white kids, but also that there's more education in schools around ethnic history, ethnic issues, and so on and so forth. Health and well-being after some of the disadvantaged issues we've seen towards the BAME community during the pandemic. Policing and hate crime, one of the biggest ones. So looking at the relationship between the BAME community and the police, and then looking at how enabled the BAME community feel to be able to call out hate crime. And then finally, community cohesion and engagement, making sure that the BAME community are very much engaged and part of our communities, so that from both sides we can get greater cohesion. Very quickly as well, I, as part of my role as chair of the Basildon IAG, have set up what's called the Hate Speech Working Group. Now, we are looking at some of the misconceptions that we often see, particularly online, but stuff that you'll hear in the pub. Things like, we've heard it, Basildon Council will not fly the St. George's flag because they don't want to offend the Muslims. Absolute poppycock. The St. George's flag is flying every day from the Basildon Council building, yet these are some of the things we see online. Nativity plays will not happen at Christmas because we don't want to offend the Muslims. Rubbish, absolute rubbish. And then some of the stuff we heard online when we were looking at our regeneration plans for the town centre, saying that we were building housing for the Londoners. We don't want the Londoners living here in Basildon. The undertone was that is, we don't want blacks, we don't want Asians, we don't want Eastern Europeans moving from London into Basildon town centre. That was the real undertone. And we're working as that group. We're in the early stages. We've been taking an approach of discover, so try and understand what the issues are. And we're now very much at the solutionized stage where we're looking at what options we've got before we move into delivering some of these activities that we hope will start to dispel the myths. Let's get online, dispelling these myths, fighting these myths that we so often hear. Looking at community cohesion events, bringing people of difference, and I hate using the word BAME, but people who are from different backgrounds into community cohesion events to normalise them in our society. giving greater access to an awareness of hate crime reporting so that people are aware of how they can report hate speech and report hate crime and where they need to go to do that. And then linking in some of these other great groups like Basildon Side by Side and More in Common Basildon Borough, which is a group I'm founder and patron of at the moment, but enabling groups to tackle hate speech as well. So looking at how do you do it? How do we get people in our community being out there and able to go out there and tackle some of this hate speech? At the end of the day, community cohesion and community resilience is really, really important. We need to find ways to bring people together for a common cause. We need to be connecting like-minded doers. That's the most powerful way that we can start to tackle some of these issues, is getting the grassroots leaders and members of the community who are doers to come out and start to tackle some of these issues together. And we're very fortunate here in Basildon to have a leadership team in the local police team who get it and who want to make a difference. And an inclusion and diversity team at the council who again get it. And through me and other leaders, we've been able to push hate speech and hate crime very much onto the agenda of many groups. And as a leader, I hope that we will start to make a real difference within this borough soon. Just to finish, Basildon More in Common Basildon Borough, which is a group that I fundraised for during my time as mayor and set up and I'm now patron of. Their key goals are to tackle loneliness and to drive greater community cohesion. And next weekend on the 16th, across the whole country, we're encouraging people as part of the Joe Cox Foundation to hold a great get together, bringing communities together to show that we are all one. We've got more in common than what divides us. It's 5 years on the 16th of June since Jo Cox was murdered by an extremist in Batley and Spen, just going about her business as an MP and holding her surgeries. And her words really resonate with me. And these are the words that we should be pushing into our communities. We are far more united and have far more in common with each other than that which divides us. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, David. And I think that really kind of roots us. I know from my own research in Basildon, I've heard those rumours about Basildon Council not flying the flag. And I've also heard rumours about nativity plays across the country. So before I move on to Niall, just going to use this as a bit of a plug as well for our next event, which is going to be on the 15th of July, same time, 11 to 12:30. And we're going to be offering a training on difficult conversations, which uses some of these empathetic listening skills that Tarek's mentioned as well, and how that can be applied at the local level. So now just going to move on to Niall, and do keep your questions coming in the Q&A box, because we'll get to those next. So finally, sorry Niall, keep you waiting. But Niall is Regional Communications Manager at IMIX, so he spends a lot of time looking at how we can change the conversation on immigration. So he's going to give us some quite grounded knowledge now on how engaging with local press can be used to challenge some of these rumours or misinformation. So over to you, Niall.
Thank you, Rosie, and yeah, good morning everyone, and thank you for this. It's been a privilege to listen to everyone speaking so far, and hopefully some of this presentation will kind of add on that from working with the local media and my experiences there. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen, which will hopefully work without any technical difficulties. So hopefully everyone is going to be able to see a PowerPoint presentation. Super, got a thumbs up. So yeah, I'll try and keep this as quick as possible. But as Rosie touched on, I'm based in Coventry and I spend a lot of time working with this charity called IMIX. And IMIX was set up about 5 years ago, around the time of the EU referendum. We're a small team of 6 and we support the migration sector across the UK, from the big national charities to small voluntary groups, and of course people with lived experience, to improve their media and communications. So a lot of the stuff we do, very briefly, is this sort of stuff, amongst other things. So that's just a few of the stories I've worked on during the past 12 months or so. And it's ultimately about trying to get stories out there that shift the attitudes on migration and make them more positive and welcoming, both in local areas and also nationally. And of course, with a context of not going into it too much because you'll all be aware, but dealing with a lot of that. So these negative, dehumanizing, anti-migrant stories that are kind of put out in the media, both in national and local press on a regular basis. And another key thing, because I imagine some of the people here today will have had to deal with that, and it's been referenced already, but those kind of crisis points where immigration seems to dominate the news agenda in quite a negative and dehumanizing way. So the two key times from last year would have been the Channel crossings. It's kind of the perfect summer holiday story for the press when nothing else is happening. And you also add hotel usage, thanks to the likes of Nigel Farage and other groups, which local groups I was working with, from authorities to charities, were coming under lots of pressure. There were quite dehumanizing stories in local press. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my experiences of the key components of putting a story together that both works for local media, but also helps to challenge some of these narratives and put our messages out there. And I'll just, shift on. So in terms of the first thing we think about, we think a lot about audiences. No need to remember all this, but there's tons of research out there, but we think of three key groups that generally all research agrees on. Of course, with those percentage points there will be regional and local caveats where they shift, but most research agrees when we're looking at it from the perspective of immigration. There's a quarter of the population who are totally opposed, very negative to it, and never going to change their mind. And we've got another quarter of people who are completely opposite and quite on board. Now, I spend most of my time thinking about this 50% in the middle, and these are referred to as kind of anxious middle or fence sitters. And the people that you have the conversations with who will say they see some benefits to immigration, but they'll also have some concerns or see some negatives about it too. And I think a lot about this audience when I'm thinking of supporting groups to get stories out there, because ultimately they can be swayed one way or another. They could become more and more opposed to immigration, or hopefully they could become more on board. From my perspective, supporting the charities I do, that should hopefully lead to more support for the charities and hopefully better decision and policy making, but also hopefully build trust and more cohesive, welcoming communities towards migrants and refugees. As Dr. Joe touched on earlier though, they generally all have one thing in common, and he was talking about kind of this information void and ignorance. And this is, I think, a big key issue we face in the immigration sector too. For the vast majority of people we're speaking to, and that's not just the general public, but also journalists as well, they have no real knowledge about refugees or migrants, their experiences, why they've come to the UK, or the challenges they face once they're in the UK. At the same time, you speak to most people about immigration, they're going to have a very strong opinion on it. And linked to that, that's probably informed by these sort of negative crisis, news agenda dominating stories, such as a Channel crisis. So we've got this potent mix of low knowledge and quite strong opinions, often informed by anti-migrant narratives and misinformation. So firstly, and just a couple of things that I'll rush through in terms of messaging and what we do. When we're thinking about putting anything together, and it's a big issue we face in the sector, everyone thinks they need to kind of sound super eloquent, professional, be getting across, sound like a poet, the next Shakespeare or Dickens. Absolutely not the case. It's all about, first of all, keeping it simple and avoiding like jargon or acronyms, because when we think about our audience we're speaking to, or when I'm thinking about getting in touch with a journalist about a story, it needs to be something they're going to understand straight away. Journalists are super busy. They're getting hundreds of emails a day to cover different things. So if your story doesn't make sense to them from the first line they read, they're not interested. And likewise, if you think about how each of you consume media, I know when I'm scrolling my phone, the TV's on in the background, I'm working and the radio's on in the background. And if someone starts speaking about something I just don't understand from the start, I'm not going to learn from it. I'm not going to engage from it. And ultimately our other aims aren't going to be achieved. But more importantly, I think hopefully the presentation hasn't froze. I'll give it a go. Thankfully it is working. But what's been touched on by the other panelists so far is about making something human and having that human story. And that's a really key part of our messages too. So we think a lot about the words and phrases we use, particularly with respect to immigration. Words like asylum seeker, migrant are often linked to words such as crisis, illegal, criminality, in those news agenda kind of dominating pieces. And so most people's interactions with those sorts of words and phrases have been in quite a negative light, and they'll have certain opinions already just if, say, for example, I put a social media post together for a charity, I put a press release together, or I'm preparing someone for an interview, straight away just leading with those words already evoke a sort of certain reaction, put us on the back foot. So when and where possible, and of course it's not always possible, but just trying to humanize a bit with our language and using things that we all have in common. And we'll show some stories that do that shortly. And of course, there's a few examples on the page there, because ultimately when it comes down to stories and messaging, it's to the British public, it's thinking, right, are they going to look at this story and also make a judgment about whether it's fair or it's not? And that's something we can do where we bring in a human story most of the time. Again, it's froze. Sorry about this. There we go. So yeah, in terms of stories, and I'll get onto the examples because that's going to be the best way to do it. But just a couple of examples how to think about it. First of all, I came in with the kind of misconception 5 years ago. I'm pretty naive. Come into the sector, well, we just give people facts, figures, evidence, kind of jobs done. We'll be absolutely fine. But that doesn't work, and there's lots of research out there to say why this sort of myth busting doesn't work. One is facts by themselves are just quite abstract, so they're difficult to connect with. And if you think of just something not related to immigration per se, but the COVID-19 pandemic, now there's tons of facts and figures out there, and it can be, we might trust some of those facts and figures, but it can be quite overwhelming. There's so many different news sources giving you different information at different times. It can be confusing at best. And also, unless you already have an opinion that sticks to that fact or figure you're getting, you're most likely to sort of distrust it. And that's exactly the same what we find with immigration, giving people facts and figures, unless it's those migration liberals, they absolutely love it. For an anxious middle sort of audience, they're just hearing facts and figures, it's abstract, it's difficult to connect with. And if you think about, say, the Windrush generation, the Windrush Scandal, that story that emerged just a few years ago, for kind of 10, 20 years, people have been speaking about this in our sector, kind of talking about there was these issues, that people were facing all these challenges. But the one thing they weren't doing was getting human stories out there. Yet as soon as the stories of, say, Paulette Wilson, a grandmother from Wolverhampton, started getting out into the press, people could connect with that straight away. There was something common, there was some shared value, and that question of fairness came in. Very quickly, just onto a few examples, and it's great to see my mouse is now working again. But yeah, these are just some examples in terms of one type of story you can tell, and I'm going to go through it very quick. But one that local journalists sort of love for a local press is focusing on that contribution. So if you've got a story of someone that's moved to a local area, be that a couple of years ago and then more newly arrived, or decades ago, just getting in the story to a local journalist going, would you like to hear from them? They're a nurse now working on the front line. Or actually, look, there's this chap that's been in Nottingham going out delivering food packages to vulnerable people. Just those sort of positive stories, journalists love them. And also they're going to evoke a certain and hopefully more better positive response from the anxious middle audience listening at home. Likewise here, there's also different ways. So it's not just focusing on contribution, but actually just things like welcome events for people. Journalists quite like to share stories that show some sort of pride or some sort of communities coming together. And I'll touch on the Express and Star piece quickly too, which is about some sanctuary seekers. And they'd kind of gone to this allotment in Wolverhampton. It was overrun, overgrown, really not great at all. And they managed to turn it into something quite beautiful. And the local press loved that story. And the thing about this was, and which I'll touch on another slide, but actually sometimes thinking about the lens we tell stories in our sector is really important too. So if we go to a person and we're directly sort of pitching or speaking a story about immigration, we might get a certain sort of response straight away. But actually this is a story about gardening. So when we pitch it in via that lens, people that are just interested in gardening might click on that, and they've already got a certain opinion, a bit more of a warm response to that. And then within the body of that story as well, they find out about some of their neighbours that they might not ordinarily meet or have already some misconceptions from other media they've read. So that's something we think a lot about too. And just finally, I know it's been spoke a little bit about the historical angle too. So the pieces on the left and the right mentioning East Anglia and sort of the Norfolk, Norwich sort of area. But I know in Coventry too, where I'm based, a city that was decimated by the Blitz, but a lot of people also take pride in terms of what the city did despite that to offer sanctuary to people escaping persecution and conflict. So sometimes as well, you can build into that common value of like historical pride in something that happened 70, 80 years ago, and use that to your advantage as well with crafting stories. Just moving on, very quick sum up, but in terms of what's useful for local journalists, I think there's three things. If you've got a human story you can offer, it's rooted in that local community, and then you've got some common theme or shared value. Journalists are really going to want to hear that, and it's a great way to tell a story too. And oh, sorry, mouse breaking again. So as I touched on that lens, and just to reiterate, you can get a different response from the same person on the same subject, depending on the story we share with them. My granddad isn't probably happy that I do this, but I know for him, for example, avid Daily Mail reader, and so every summer when the Channel Crossing stories emerge, I'll have a certain conversation with him, and we won't see eye to eye. Yeah, if I tell him the Express and Star story about the gardening group, because he's an avid gardener and he reads that, and I did that with him, I got a completely different response. Or I tell him about the bakery around the corner from me in Coventry, which ended up in the Coventry Telegraph, Daily Mirror and BBC 5 Live. Now, this was a story of 3 women that had come from Syria. They were war widows, they'd come here with their young children, and they're all bakers back home. And they set up a bakery in the back of a church in Coventry. And then during the start of the pandemic, they realised that a local food bank was coming under increasing pressure. So they started donating hundreds of loaves of bread each week to the local food bank. That was a great story to sell into the local, and it went national press too. And in terms of shifting attitudes, breaking down some of those barriers, challenging some of those stereotypes and those anti-migrant narratives, it was a great way to do that. Just finally, and then I'll sum up, but the final thing, and it's been spoken about a bit, it's about having an authentic messenger. So when we're putting stories out there, thinking about the person that's going to resonate most. I'd say 9 times out of 10, from my perspective, and thinking about immigration, I always want it to be with someone with lived experience. But of course, when you've gone through like a rigorous safeguarding process and they've got informed consent about both the pros and negatives of conducting media work, which we don't have time to speak about today, but also thinking about what unexpected or non-sector voices could be utilised. So one of the big stories we always deal with and deal with a lot is that story of refugees are the cause of the housing crisis, and the likes of Britain First, Farage and others pushing those narratives out. And sometimes it does get into local press. Of course, the sector I work in, the charities want to come out, they want to say, yeah, this is absolutely not the case. And for some of that anxious middle audience, it might land and it might connect with them. Yeah, with this Guardian piece that it also went in the Birmingham Mail because it was a story that emerged out of Birmingham. We got the likes of Crisis and Shelter on board and actually got them to share our messages. So non-immigration sort of sector specific voices, but people, organisations that for the general public hold clout as being organisations with expertise on homelessness, on destitution, and actually having them to share our messages instead of the kind of expected refugee or migrant charity is also something to consider. Just finally, I just wanted to share this with you. And this is just a slide from Ipsos Mori, how public concern about immigration has shifted over the past 20 years or so. I would say with this, it's for the entire UK. So of course, there's going to be very regional and local contexts and differences to this. But just quickly, you can see around the time of the Brexit vote that concern about immigration was at an all-time high. Since then, it's steadily declined. And of course, there's lots of different reasons for that. One, lots of people thought the issue of immigration was solved the day after the Brexit vote. But we've also had a COVID-19 pandemic leading the news agenda during the past few years, during the past 18 months, sorry. And of course, that's what's main concern to people. But there is research out there that shows over the last sort of 2, 3, 4 years in particular, there are more of these community positive led stories being put out there. And I'd like to think that that's had some impact on these attitudes too. So of course, we're pragmatic, we're realistic, and it does take time. But I do think the more confidence we have and the more we can share those sorts of stories, it will help with challenging some of those anti-migrant narratives. That's everything from me. So I'll stop the screen share now. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Niall. So we've done quite a journey today. We've gone from kind of big QAnon global conspiracy theories right down to the Birmingham Mail and how that could be used to challenge some of these local myths. So we've got some questions trickling in through the Q&A. So do keep those coming in. I think there's definitely some kind of key themes to take away from this, that challenging misinformation has online and offline elements and that the two interact. And I think as well, we've heard from all speakers about the importance of these messages being grounded, being trusted, but also being real. So I'm going to move just to the first question. So Morris has come in to say that he frequently reports racist Facebook posts, but the vast majority are judged to not be in breach of Facebook standards by the moderators. Does Facebook in the UK have any dialogue with Hope Not Hate about this issue in light of what Joe was saying? And I guess a follow up from that question as well, what can be done? Because a lot of this misinformation does fall into those slightly grey areas, but can have more extreme consequences. So I'm going to start with Joe on that.
Yeah, it's wildly frustrating, right? Because these tech companies have failed for a decade on this issue. And, you know, they have moments where they seem to be getting better and moments when they get worse again. But there is a huge issue with them not, the terms and conditions are not the problem. The terms and conditions for most of the major platforms is relatively robust. The issue is they don't hold them, you know, they don't apply them when people report content. We work very closely with tech companies. We've got a very critical but close relationship in terms of, it allows us to be what they call a trusted partner in some cases, which allows us to report content that we've got real problems with, and it's kind of elevated straight to a person, etc. And this has allowed us to do like really important work for us. That means we've deplatformed Tommy Robinson from Facebook, you know, getting rid of David Icke when we're talking about conspiracies. Like, having those relationships is really important. The problem, of course, is that not everyone has that luxury, and we're really aware of that. And one of the big things we're always pushing them on, I mean, just TikTok last week, right? TikTok has got some of the strongest terms on this issue around hate speech, etc. And really basic stuff, like from a private account, I reported some pro-ISIS content and it stayed up, and they kind of came back and said, we've looked at it and it's fine. So we're now in the conversation with them saying, how can you, even if pro-ISIS content isn't getting taken down, there's a major problem here. Now, one of the things is they say that it doesn't count. It's just every report is treated the same. If there's 20 reports or one report, it's no different. I'm not convinced by that, actually, because we often find that if you report something and then like we report from another account, after the second time or the third time, they might pull it down. So a flag obviously goes up next to that piece of content. So I do think that it's sometimes worth bombarding them if you can, to try and get it pulled down. And if there are things that you think are really egregious, especially in terms of like things that Hope Not Hate are working on around the migrant cross-channel migration or far-right specific stuff, it is worth dropping an email to something like info@hopenothate.org.uk, and sometimes if we've got the capacity, can flag it. And if we flag it, sometimes it will come down quicker. But the good news is on all this is that we have the online harms bill coming forward, which has been taken about 2 years, but there's now a draft bill, and it's not perfect. But there are quite strong penalties in there for companies not upholding their policies. And so hopefully, I mean, that's another thing we can all do is like speak to our MPs, right, to, you know, lobby our local MPs about the bill. Hope Not Hate have actually just published a blog a few days ago with some of the areas that we have concerns about, and it's about to go into committee. So there's a chance to try and push around some of this. So do kind of engage with this and raise local issues on this bill, because there's a real chance next year that some of these issues that we've all been complaining about for years with the tech companies, there's going to be some weighty legislation behind it, which will allow us to kind of force the tech companies to do more. But I would say, yeah, keep reporting. It's really frustrating, and there are ways you can challenge if it comes back. Try, and if you think the piece of content is having a real negative effect, try and get other people to report it, etc. Some cases it just won't work. There's no way around it. Sometimes their terms and conditions, what they think is racism or what we think are racism, are not the same thing. But do push for it. And I'd say if you see something really dangerous and it's not working, getting it down, sometimes drop us in it. And we won't always have the capacity to write an email to Facebook or Twitter or TikTok, but we'll always try and do that. But yeah, I mean, the tech companies are majorly flawed institutions. And so, you know, do jump on the online harm stuff because it's really important.
Brilliant, thanks, Joe. And just to say as well on the kind of online harms element, the Towns Project is looking for start working on a series of guides of things that can really be done grounded in reality. So that might be something that we can pick up on if helpful. And I've just circulated the link to a feedback form, so please do complete that, and you can put in any suggestions for things that you think would be helpful from us there. So I'm just going to move to the next question. I'm going to try and kind of weave two questions into one. So a question from Brian Williams. Speakers, what are your 3 elements or values for interacting with a community? And another question from an anonymous attendee. Who do we regard as these community leaders that have been referred to throughout this? Some so-called leaders are actually gatekeepers who don't truly represent or disseminate messages to all they claim to represent in a fair and equal manner. So there can be some instances where they can also be behind some of the tensions that are being tackled. So quite an open question there, and then a slightly difficult but truth that we all have to try and work with as well. So I'm going to come to anyone who wants to speak on that. Your 3 elements for communities, and that question about who they are as well. I'm going to start with David.
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the community leaders. To me, a community leader is anyone who has a voice that a group will listen to within that community. So a community leader is not just the council, is not just the police, is not just the mayor, is not just the leader of the council. A community leader could be a leader of a residents group. It could be somebody who set up a Facebook page that based on a particular issue or whatever it might be. To me, it's somebody who has a voice, and you are absolutely right that sometimes those voices could be portraying a message that's very damaging. So for me, it's always about, and going on to the 3 words, linking that in, the way I view engagement with community is one, is to listen, and listening is really important, because actually there's some genuine, real reasons sometimes why individuals may feel aggrieved about a certain issue or about immigration or whatever it might be. So let's listen and try and understand what those issues are. And then the second thing is about empathy, because actually the answer is not just to turn around and go, you're wrong. Yeah, your beliefs, what's ingrained in your mind, what your perception of this issue is wrong. Now, if you tell somebody they're wrong, you're not going to get the engagement to try and help them understand why they're wrong. So it's about empathizing. Look, I understand how you are feeling. However, let's talk about some reasons why there might be another view on that. And that's the third thing for me, is the challenge, but positive challenge, yeah? And I said when I was speaking earlier, I try and tackle these issues with positivity, because if you go back with negativity, you're creating a further issue yourself, and you're not getting the engagement from those individuals who are perhaps not on your side of the fence in terms of your thinking. You need to go back with a positive message. And actually some of the stuff Niall spoke about those positive stories and getting those positive stories out really resonated with me. When somebody's tackling refugees or whatever it might be, and then you come back and say, well, look, here's the wonderful contribution some people who have come here seeking sanctuary have actually made to our community during the pandemic and outside of the pandemic. So it's 3 things for me. It's listen, engage, and then positively challenge.
Brilliant, thanks David. I'm not sure whether anyone else wants to come back on that with 3 succinct points, or who are these community leaders and how do you make sure they're the right ones? Tarek, I feel like you might.
So on community leaders, we've never talked about community leaders in our project. We're talking about people having conversations, but there's some times when, if it's really useful for things to happen, who are the people in a place who have got some clout and other people listen to, whoever that is, and you only know who that is when you get to know people in a place. So that's that. But the three elements, what was that question again about three? What was the whole question?
3 elements for interacting with the community.
I came ready today with a thing to show people, which is we've got 3 principles, and I'm going to tell you what they are, because I don't know if it's the same thing. I can even put it up on the screen. Is that all right? If I can find it. No, I can't find it. I'll just tell you what they are. So our 3 principles. Number 1, better out than in. That's nothing to do with no referendum. That's people having conversations. It's better if people say stuff than don't say stuff, whatever it is. That's principle number 1. Principle number 2 is most people are all right. All right meaning sincere, good-hearted, well-intentioned. So not everybody is, you know, there's some nasty, malicious people out there, and in a lot of stuff that we're all dealing with, you might encounter a lot of the nasty, malicious, but most people, sincere, well-intentioned, good-hearted people. And even if you're in the middle of hearing stuff that you're finding really difficult to hear, if people are sincere, well-intentioned, good-hearted, that is a way of being able to go with hearing difficult things. And the third principle of ours is curiosity. And what I mean by that is we never aim for, like, there's a particular right answer, right story, or anything else. What we're aiming for is everybody comes out of conversations going, I want to know more, I want to understand more, I've got questions. Why do I think what I think? And that's everybody, including us. So if I'm a facilitator of a conversation, and I say this to all our facilitators in our project, if you're holding a conversation and you come out not questioning yourself, you're doing something wrong. So everybody's got to be doing that. That's me 3.
Thanks, Tarek. That's great. I'm not sure whether anyone else wants to come in on this, so I'll move on to the next one. Yeah, Niall?
Yeah, just very, very briefly, in terms of like the 3 key steps, I mean, as it was touched on, but in terms of, first of all, particularly where you're not, I cover the whole of the West Midlands, and while I've grown up here, but there's some areas, there's some communities I just don't know that much about. So first of all, as it's touched on by David, really important to kind of listen to concerns, and also for the communities I'm working with as well. So I've got no lived experience of moving to the UK, so actually sitting down with the people that I'm going to be putting forward for media opportunities as well, and finding out what's important to them, what they want to speak about, and then if there is some way I can support that, great. Then in terms of actually crafting something, once I understand those concerns and understand the communities, from, if I don't have their experience, I can learn that from someone else. It's finding something in common. So having that thing in common. So you saw that gardening story. There was, I think, one story about football, for example. So, I mean, a great story at the moment, if any of the groups here, we've got community groups involved in football, your local paper will bite your hand off with the Euros coming up. And straight away, you get this football story out there. People I know in Coventry or my hometown, Tamworth, people just interested in football that might have some of those anti-migrant sort of narratives. Straight away, they're reading the piece because they're interested in football, and they might decide to engage with it. Not everyone, but some will. And finally, it's having that right messenger. So I think that was brought from the other question too. And yeah, often I sometimes find perhaps that isn't a person from the council, or what I'll often find when I was working at the local charity down the road, they always wanted someone like me to go on radio. Well, I'm not really going to connect with the audience at home, but actually someone with lived experience, ideally, who has been in Coventry for a little while, who can speak from the heart and speak about their experiences, that is going to have a much better chance of connecting. So yeah, listening, having something in common, and having the right messenger.
Brilliant, thanks so much. I think we've had quite a lot of kind of chains coming through this. I think the vehicle is just as important as the message is a really key thing. So just going to go to one last question, because we've got 5 minutes left. But what are the key steps that you think an average person can do to change a negative narrative? So I'm going to use my position as chair to say that I think the most important thing that came out today is that connection between online and offline, and the fact that it has to be grounded in people's realities. So I'm going to open that up to the panel now. Anyone going to bite, or I'll pick on you? Let's make a start with Joe.
thought you were going to do that. So that I could sort of ask the question again.
What can the average person do to challenge these narratives of misinformation?
Yeah, so one of the things we've found, I mean, it's a really difficult question. I mean, the first thing I'd say is it really depends what it is in terms of where you challenge it. You know, if you're walking down the road and there's a drunk skinhead screaming stuff, you might not be the best person to throw yourself into that dangerous situation. So always kind of make sure you don't get yourself in trouble. But one of the things we've found so much of people contacting us and calling us at Hope Not Hate is like, my auntie has started to believe this. My brother has gone down this rabbit hole and started to engage with this sort of information. And one of the things I think that's really important is screaming idiot, right? As tempting as it can sometimes be, especially with some of the more outlandish stuff we'll come across, is really counterproductive. And I know that sounds so obvious, but so the knee-jerk reaction of so many people when they come across people that are engaging with conspiracy theory content or blatant or what seems like obvious misinformation is to just kind of laugh at them or say, don't be so stupid, this is absolutely ridiculous, because we find that, of course, re-entrenches their views, especially for anything along the conspiracy theory element of it, because a huge part of those conspiracies is often we are forcibly shut down, we are attacked, we are told not to have these views, and as a result sometimes you can end up reconfirming their existing position. And it's kind of been mentioned a little bit earlier, but within a lot of these things there is a small kernel of truth that has been extrapolated out or has been kind of changed in some way, and there's no harm in sometimes conceding that and starting the conversation from that point of common ground and engaging with people. I mean, there'll be people, you know, the other speaker panelists will be much better at this than I will be. So the only thing I would really say is that once something crosses the line, obviously at Hope Not Hate we have kind of a policy. If someone's not denying the Holocaust, I'm not going to sit down and debate them. I'm going to work to ostracize them. If someone's attacking people physically, etc., these are just red lines. It's not about I kind of understand your position. We're going to, at Hope Not Hate, we're going to go to war with those people. But for a lot of the stuff we've discussed, it is about engagement, as has been said, and it's about doing so in an empathetic and listening and understanding way. And then just on the messengers thing and the kind of community leaders stuff that was mentioned before, I too kind of sometimes get reticent that these community leaders are there's these obvious people, you know, we turn up in a community and speak to community leaders. I remember when I worked on the campaign team at Hope Not Hate, it was exactly as Tariq said, it's like, who do people listen to here? And that takes being rooted in those communities. And sometimes in certain communities, the people we wanted to speak to listen to their football coach or their boxing coach far more than they did any religious leader or council, you know, activist or whatever it was. And so on that sort of thing, again, when we're having these difficult conversations around these complex issues, is being empathetic, but also sometimes understanding that we might not be the best person to have that conversation and trying to find someone who might be better placed to have that conversation. I think those things are usually a good starting spot when it comes to kind of challenging some of the narratives around misinformation. But I mean, don't appease these things. I don't want to, that's the other problem I get is often when we talk about, you know, engagement, etc., it can come across, if you do it wrongly, it's saying you're appeasing these views and that. So we're never going to cross that line, but engaging, I think, is fine.
Brilliant, thanks, Joe. Very quickly, not sure if anyone else can give a kind of one-line answer to that. What can the average person do? Look at you, David.
I'm just going back to what I said before, my 3 points. Listen, empathize and engage, and positively challenge. And actually something Joe said earlier about, you know, we need to be on all these Facebook groups and so on and so forth, where a lot of this rhetoric's, you know, being spouted, and we need to be positively challenging in those sort of arenas as well. You know, I am not shy about putting an alternative point of view across in the right way on Facebook groups if I see something that's probably not the right thing to be saying.
Brilliant. So what last words, and I do mean words, please, Tariq and Niall. Or no words is also fine.
No, I'm happy. Just very quickly, I wasn't sure whether Tariq wanted to go first, but yeah, quickly just touching on what Joe said earlier in terms of like this information void. So just as a request for those from kind of local councils, local authorities, often I've found in my experience can be gatekeepers and rightly concerned about sharing some of these positive stories because they're worried about a backlash from sharing those stories. But without that, sometimes then charity is not willing to speak out in those areas. It does leave us with this information void. So I'd just say, when and where possible, kind of taking that confidence and looking to share some of those success stories would be fantastic.
Thanks, Niall. That's a really, really good point. So I think, Tarek, unless you've got any desperate last words, we're going to wrap up.
Not desperate, but I'm just going to go back to what Joe said about red lines. Make a judgment. Is it something you can get stuck into? Isn't it? If you're out and about, if it isn't, don't. If it is, that's your judgment. That's
Okay.
it.
Thanks. I think that there's definitely a point of being careful not to give oxygen to dangerous ideas that might harm people. But at the same time, just to reiterate Niall's point, is having the confidence to speak out in certain spaces as well. So thank you so much for everyone for your very engaged participation today. We will be sending around a recording of this as well as a learning note. And just to flag that this is kind of one of the last webinars. So the next one we're going to be running is the 15th of July. As I said, it's going to be a difficult conversations training tailored to this network. So 11 to 12:30 on the 15th is a date for your diaries. We're also circulating a feedback form, not just to kind of get a sense of how useful you found this session, but also what you would like us to see us do for the network kind of moving forward. We're looking to develop a series of practical grounded guides as the next step. What can be done to address all of these issues that we've explored in this webinar series? What are the steps that can be taken at a local level to build resilience? So we'll be circulating all of those by email. So thanks once again to all of our speakers. It's been a really fantastic session and we hope it's been useful for everyone. Thanks very much.